Hey guys, GhazzyTV here with another Path of Exile League Start video. In this one, I'm going to promote what, in my opinion, the best League starting minion build for any new or newer players. And that is, of course, the Dominating Blow Summoner. Now, this build can be played as both a Guardian as well as a Necromancer. I tend to prefer the Necromancer style simply because it has inherited modifiers such as increased duration for your minions, but as well as very good, easy to come by layers of defense. However, it is important to keep in mind that the reason this is one of the solid League starter builds is because it can actually handle endgame mapping as well as the initial endgame bosses with basically items found on the ground. Anything this build requires to kill endgame bosses can literally be self-found even for the newest or newer player around in the Great Class community. As per usual, you'll find all the links and descriptions listed down below, and that includes the written guide for this build, which includes in-depth description of everything from leveling to skills to gems and gear and much more. And what's really good with leveling and Dominating Blow is that I personally prefer to level with the ability that I'm supposed to use in the endgame rather than having to switch at a later stage. Dominating Blow is actually able to be leveled as early as from level 28. It's definitely not among the fastest way to level, but it's still very doable, which I very much prefer to do. Smooth, effect, subscribe. What? Okay. Where was I? Subscribe. Jesus Christ. Sorry about that. Where was I? Subscribe now. Fuck, you heard the man. Subscribe! The way to summon your Dominated Sentinels is by either dealing a killing blow, having the enemy die that you've hit recently, or a % chance of hitting a rare or unique enemy, very much similar to the Absolution. The Sentinels are limited to 9 normal, 3 magic, and 1 rare Sentinel that you can have at any given time. There is an exception to this, which is the alternative quality version of Dominating Blow called Phantasmal Dominating Blow, which provides us with an additional normal sentinel per 10% quality on the gem, which we are focusing on heavily actually with the higher budget version. But let's stick to the low budget version here, shall we? Understanding the mechanics of Dominating Blow is important as its unique design is what makes this build so cool. The sentinel summoned is based off the rarity of the enemies killed. So any normal monsters will spawn normal sentinels. Magic rarities will spawn magic sentinels, and of course the rares will spawn a rare sentinel. In 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum League, GHAZZY has removed Arch Nemesis modifiers. This is directly affecting Dominating Blow, since the magic and rare sentinels are copying the monster modifiers that it was spawned from. Based on the patch notes, we're going to encounter rares with 2 up to 4 modifiers. Our sentinels will continue to copy these modifiers, which are going to be slightly less dangerous and therefore slightly less effective for the build than they were back in Arch Nemesis. However, as much as this is an indirect nerf to Dominating Blow, the enemies are also made significantly easier, which counters this nerf directly. When fighting endgame bosses, you'll only be spawning the normal sentinels simply because you're hitting a unique target, which does not have any modifiers. Since it can take some time to summon all your sentinels, the build is by far not recommended to use for boss farming. It is instead recommended as a great, cheap, and most importantly, effective league starting character and for general mapping. To go through the POB, this is the low budget version of the Dominating Blow, and as you can see, the DPS is kicking about 4 million shape per DPS in its current version. Do keep in mind that this one is looking at the finished low budget gearing, which does have a couple of items that might cost a little bit more currency than what I'd expect out of the first couple of days of a league. So do keep in mind that you'll most likely end up with a little bit lower DPS than this if you're early starting pretty effectively. Before we go through the gear, I do want to talk about the tree regularly from the start. The written guide in the description will cover these things in detail, as you can level all the way out here in the start or take the spell damage notes if you so wish to do, all the way up to level 12, at which point you can start using Absolution, similar to many of the other summoner or witches that you can level. By taking Enduring Bond and some extra HP early on helps a lot by achieving a smooth leveling experience in the start of a league. At level 28, you are able to switch to Dominating Blow. Normally, I would wait a little bit until you get all the way through the nodes here to pick up Sacrifice so that you can enable Meat Shield Zombies. When you have sacrifice and you're running raised zombie, during the end of Act 2, middle of Act 3, your zombie should, for the most part, be reliably kept alive thanks to the regen and extra HP. By going through the nodes all the way here and skipping the reservation nodes, you can choose to go for the Righteous Army as well as Redemption. These two nodes will give you so much damage with the Absolution that you should keep that all the way till you run down the tree to Resolute Technique. The reason you want to wait till you have this node before switching to Dominating Blow is very simple. Since you might not always do the killing blows yourself, but rather having your help from your utility or meat shield minions, in this case being the zombies, to do the killing for you, it is very important that when you hit an enemy that you do not miss. Resolute Technique takes away any sort of needed stats in terms of accuracy rating or anything of the sort, allowing you to guarantee hits at all times. So when the enemy dies, either by your hand or by your other minions, you will then summon sentinels to do your bidding. After this, normally since I rush this, I normally have a little bit of a lack of HP nodes, upon which I will prioritize to pick up Devotion, as these nodes here gives a little bit more life than the other life nodes available on the tree that you're pathing. Do keep in mind that I would not skip the 3 nodes here for the mana, regen, and HP on top of the life mastery as you're progressing early on. This includes Retribution and at least picking up the Discipline and Training before running over to the left-hand side of the tree. Outside of that, I would only skip the Sanctum of Thought and the Jewel nodes and simply take the other nodes as needed. I would skip the Grave Intentions until very late in the mapping because it has more to do with keeping minions alive versus harder chaos damaging minions or enemies in the endgame stage, and rather prioritize picking up Grave Pact, the Combat Stamina, which gives you armor and HP and life regen to help you stay alive since you're going to be in melee range, as well as Tireless or even Sanctuary, so get some extra block and resistances to help alleviate the drop of resistances when you finish certain acts such as Act 5 and then later Act 10. Outside of that, it's very straightforward. When it comes to the bandits, you want to kill them all because they don't really benefit you. Ascendancy-wise, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. First off, I would go for mindless aggression, and then I would either choose a natural strength or bone barrier, but since I do prefer the bone barrier approach in the early stage of the game, and simply unholy might through unnatural strength is a mere damage increase, and as I mentioned earlier, by taking the redemption as well as righteous army nodes very early on, this will carry you for a very long time. Because of that, I normally tend to go for Bone Barrier, and the third, also called Merc Lab, I would take the Mistress of Sacrifice, because at the end game you're going to want to have a trigger craft on your weapon. This is all covered in detail in the written guide, of course, to give yourself the extra layers of defense through using a Bone Offering, which will give you extra block chance as well. This will also help your minions survive, and at the later stages of the Uber Lab, you're going to then pick up the Unnatural Strength. The reason we do this is because we're not essentially using poison or chaos damage until we reach the higher end game gearing for this character. The reason for this is obviously because in the link section, we're going to be using Chance to Poison. This is not something we'll use whilst we're leveling. Same thing goes for Unbound Ailments, whereas the rest of the support does about the same. There is a 2 gem swap that I do when I'm comparing general mapping versus the proper endgame pinnacle bosses like Eater of Worlds or Shaper, for example. And that is switching Multi-Strike and Predator for melee splash and minion speed to create a generically smoother clearing approach. And the reason we do this setup is to make sure that we reach, as soon as you can, 100% chance to poison. When you reach the higher end game of the campaign or the early stage of mapping, it is crucial that you should be looking into the chance to poison approach, even if you don't have 100% chance to poison. It will already at that point be a very strong contender to the version you're currently playing through the campaign, and it is very important to keep in mind that you're still lacking 60% chance to poison. This means that the most important items to purchase or craft, depending on if you're playing solo self-hunt or in a trade league, is to get yourself the Ghastly Eye Jewels, which provides you with the availability of getting extra chance to poison on hit. I'll cover this in the gear section in just a moment. The trigger weapon craft is obviously going to keep that Desecrate and Bone Offering strategy like we normally do in most minion builds, and in here I'm actually using Despair as a triggered ability to avoid casting it multiple times over. In 3.20, this is obviously going to be buffed, which will be reflected in the PUB once it's updated, which it currently is not, as you're looking at the 3.19 version. Again, written guide in link to the description will be updated before the league launches, so there might be some changes from what you're watching in this video. There is a 2-link 1-socket setup. Very important to point out that they are spread. The reason for this is because you do not want to link your convocation with your spell totem. You can unlink a 3-link item by using another Orb of Fusing if need be. You do want to link spell totem with Wither, however, because this allows you to apply the Wither through a spell totem rather than having to cast it yourself, because you will be busy attacking enemies to keep summoning your minions or maintaining the army that you have. Aura-wise, we'll be running a Tempest Shield, Determination, Defiance Banner, and a Vitality Aura in the endgame stage. Do keep in mind that if you're running short on the nodes in terms of aura reservation, or if you're having mana problems, skipping the Vitality is an option, but I would strongly recommend not to skip out of it too much, because in the endgame, Vitality will help you sustain your HP to a very high degree. As you can look on the left-hand side, we're only leeching a little bit based off our base weapon, which I'll tackle in a bit, but life regen is through the roof, almost sitting at 600 life per second, whilst you only have 5,600 HP with a very hefty amount of EHP. The utility minions is of course an Animate Guardian, which is actually not included in the actual character's guide. There is a description for how to use the Animate Guardian as well as an in-depth guide to cover it, but most people don't seem to be using the Animate Guardian for a variety of reasons. I think this is something that I'm trying to change the mentality in the community for, because the Animate Guardian can bring so many benefits for minion builds. This build is focusing so much on the defenses, and with 3.20, minion survivability should be through the roof and better than ever. So please do not skip out on the Animate Guardian guide, because it will bring so many boons to this type of build. There's anything from defensive stats to offensive stats, even with a low budget version of the Animate Guardian. The other utility minions is of course the raised zombies, like I mentioned earlier, which we're linking together with minion life, and in here I have a flame dash. The reason I'm not using the generic feeding frenzy in here is because I would like the minion life to be on both the zombies as well as the Animate Guardian, and therefore I'm using a feeding frenzy to be linked with a stone golem, which will actually have a taunt ability as well as providing you with extra life regen. In here, I have the generic movement skill that we'll actually be using outside of Flame Dash to get over obstacles, and that is the shield charge setup with faster attacks. When it comes to the item section, it is crucial to understand that the attacks per second that we will be generating is very important. Mana is also very important. This means that the type of item that you want, you don't really care about how much damage you're doing. Instead, you actually care about the type of base item you'll be using. And the best item to use for this is very cheap and very available in a trade leaf specifically, and that is a Gemini Claw. The only thing that matters is the actual attack speed and having that trigger crafted from the benchcraft, which you can find from unveiling items from the betrayal encounters. The way to get minion damage on this is to use an Essence of Fear. The higher tier essence, the higher the minion damage you get, and you can roll this multiple times over if you have the currency till you get a decent attack speed roll, and then put a bench craft for the craft in. And the reason the Gemini Claw is so good is because it gives you not just the life on hit, which scales very effectively with higher attack speed, but it has mana gained on hit. Once you get this, your trigger abilities that cost extra mana, or the mana spent on using your dominating blow, will suddenly not matter, and you do not need to use any backup solutions such as a mana flask. The shield itself is one of the more expensive items, which I don't think is really necessary until you start fiddling around with the red tier maps, or even higher than that, and that is to finally get yourself a recovery of life when you block shield. Normally, people go for the surrender, which is a very solid option. However, surrender has a tendency of being very expensive. So any sort of shaper or influence shield that gives you preferably a lot of armor, HP, any stats or resistances that you might need, as well as a recovery of life on block, is definitely the preferable route. Do keep in mind that in most of my PUBs, I actually do not cover the attribute requirements or the resistances outside of putting them into a configuration in the custom modifiers. This is basically to tell people that, hey, you need to make sure that your gear supplies you with the attributes you need to use your gear and your gems, as well as capping your elemental resistances. Getting chaos resistance is very preferable, but not something I'm focusing on low budget builds, but definitely something to keep in mind. Outside of this, the helmet we're using, you'd like to have a +2 level of all minion skills with a decent life roll. As I mentioned earlier, this PUB with the gear you're watching right now has the finished endgame gear for the low budget. This means that the +2 can sometimes, this helmet, for example, can be a little bit expensive, and having one that gives you +1 level of all minion skills is more than enough to get started for the highest endgame content with a build like this. It is using a tabula rasa, which is one of the most common to go-to choices that I run when I'm showcasing low-budget builds, to display that the build is able to tackle endgame content like I did with this character at the end of 3.19, killing Eater of Worlds and in high tier 16 endgame maps, using a tabula rasa itself as well with this build specifically. There's a generic set of gloves, preferably again with a baseline of armor, with life and armor, any resistances and attributes, of course, if needed. Boots is the same, but also including movement speed, which is very important here. The amulet, I tend to use a dexterity-based amulet, and in here we're actually anointing corruption to increase the efficiency of our wither. The rings are 2 bone rings, upon which you don't really need the extra minion resistances. And this is because the base resistance of your minions is 40% elemental resistances, and thanks to Commander Darkness, if you choose to run this, will give you another 30% to them. However, if you choose to run this setup, which I'm running, then you're suddenly going to be needing more than the initial couple of percent resistances. So the cap is at 75%, which you can bring to 83 with a minion defensive mastery if you so wish. As you can see here, we're going to be doing this. That means that we need 83% resistances, which essentially means that 83 minus 40 means that we're lacking 43% minion resist. With 43% minion resist, it is important to point out that it is preferable to have at least 2 of these rings, but one of them will be needing a little bit of minion resistance roll as well, to make sure that all your minions are covered and capped in resistances, which will keep them all safe. Outside of this, of course, we'll be using minion damage if you can get that, but any life roll, and preferably a benchcraft for non-challenge skills that have reduced mana cost, will help significantly as well. Any combination of these rings are more than enough, and for lower initial stage of mapping, even resistance rings for yourself to cap your res and get some life is more than enough. This is simply, again, the highest endgame gearing you'll see on a low-budget approach. Darkness Enthroned is a to-go-to choice for most minion builds, in which we'll be using flat life ghastly eye jewels with a chance to poison on hit. The reason we have these jewels inside the Darkness Enthroned is because of the 75% increased effect of socketed abyss jewels. The way these are calculated is very straightforward. So in this case, we have 15% chance to poison on hit, which is then multiplied by 1.75, which is rounded down because decimals in PoE is in almost all cases rounded down. This means that 2 of these 15% chance to poison on hit jewels actually gives me 26 times 2, which is 52% chance to poison on hit, together with the 40% from the chance to poison on hit support gem, which is 40%, which is on 92%. Obviously, you could do this calculation yourself and have maybe 13 or 14% chance to poison hit on a GHAZZY jewel inside your Darkness Enthroned, and therefore you only need 1 additional chance to poison on hit jewel with whatever percent, because even a bottom roll would be enough to make sure that this is 100% or more to guarantee that every hit from your minions will actually poison, as that's how we're going to do our endgame damage. Outside of this, we just need to run any sort of life with, make sure you have life, but any sort of minion damage if you used a minion skill recently, because that's something we'll be using all the time, or any flat added physical damage will be more than enough to run as well, as it will scale your damage significantly as well. One of the more highest endgame, and in my opinion, the latest upgrade you want to invest into this build, unless it's super cheap, would be the Anonymous Gaze. This jewel will scale extra percentage damage multiplier per GHAZZY jewel affecting you up to a maximum of 30%. This will give you 30% more damage multiplier in the higher levels, and again, one of the reasons we're waiting with this till the end game is simply because it will require you to have additional jewels. Since it caps at 30%, you'll need this one and 4 additional GHAZZY jewels. We'll get 2 from the Darkness Enthroned, and then you need another 2, and jewels is normally the last things you'll add into the build. Another thing to mention is why we're not putting this jewel specifically in the Darkness Enthroned to scale it, and that is because of the simple fact that the attributes and the 6% per jewel actually does scale, but the cap is hard locked. So you cannot scale the cap of this, therefore it is not worth putting in the Darkness Enthroned, so please do not do that. Flask-wise, we have the option of running the Runic Concoction for build-oriented, the builds orienting around block. This is a matter of personal preference. I like to use it to make sure that I get as close or on top of the cap as possible. Other options, such as an instant roll life flask that removes bleeding, is a common to-go-to choice for me. Other than that, we're running a Quicksilver flask and an extra regen flask if you feel the need to, and then I'm running a Basalt flask. If I'm not running a Roomies, I will use a normal or magic rarity Granite flask instead. Keep in mind that modifiers such as the Armadillo suffix modifier will allow you to get extra armor during the flask effect. You can run other modifiers such as immunity to shock or whatever else you feel like you need. More details about this will be in the written guide. When it comes to prefix modifiers of flasks, you can use the Flagellant or Flagellant modifier or other versions of it, such as Masochist or Transgressor as they're called. This specific modifier actually makes it so that when enemies hit you, you will gain flask charges. When you block an attack, that still counts as you being hit. This actually helps you maintain the charges of your flask to keep the actual usage and the uptime of these flasks at an all-time high when you're clearing maps. This pretty much covers the entire League Start promotion of the Dominating Blows Summoner. If you like this video on the format of everything we're doing in the last couple of days with these videos, please let me know in the descriptions below. Hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. So till then, stay safe. Keep rocking.